The definitive ancient history of Black people, the untold history of the start of civilization from 15,000 to 300 BC, the tale of a lost civilization that spanned the globe in ancient times. From the Natufians, ancient Sahara, Sumerian, Pelasgians, Ethiopians, Etruscans, early Greek, Egyptians, Chinese, Mesoamericans, Great Zimbabwe, and Nubians. It is only through a diligent study of the past that one can perceive the mosaic of the self. Sources are cited in the video and linked in the description. In no way through this study are we saying that the ancient people who benefited were not capable of civilization building. History shows that all people, given the right conditions, are. In this exercise, however, we must follow where the evidence takes us. We must listen to what the evidence says. The trails are loud and deafening, the research numerous, and physical and genetic evidence undeniable and still present till this day. At the end of the last ice age in 11,700 BC, archaeology shows that humans were already populating the Earth with a significant presence in the Fertile Crescent and the Levant. The Younger Dryas may well have reset civilization when it occurred 12,900 years ago. But who were the people who picked up the pieces and built the underpinnings of our civilization? What did they look like? What challenges did they have to overcome? And what sort of knowledge did they impart onto the classical empires we know today? From agriculture to mathematics to religion, law, and order, humans started building ever more complex societies. This is the story of the people who civilized this latest instance of humanity, a people so advanced and so influential when compared to its contemporaries that it can only be described as Atlantean. This work takes an incredible amount of research, writing, and editing. Give us a like and share our content on your social media. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm allows us to show our true history. It goes a long way to helping spread the truth about our often denied collective heritage. The term civilization has a pretty wide scope. This organism will grow through any means necessary, via culture, technology, language, religion, genetic identity, even written history, so we can identify it by its traits and by the clues it leaves behind. It can go from a small country with significant history lasting only a few decades, but it also applies to an empire that is spread across contiguous continents and lasts 2 centuries. What if I told you that there is a civilization that was so large it spanned the whole globe, so enduring it lasted longer than Egypt, and that wherever it went, it didn't destroy but elevated the inhabitants of the land? Its relics are now mountainous ruins, its deed, fables, and its people, but a shell of their former glory. We begin in 12,500 BC in a small community in modern-day Syria. The climate is starting to warm, indicating that we are coming out of the last ice age. Humans are about to do something they have never done before, something that will forever alter the course of civilization. Instead of getting their sustenance from hunting and scavenging, humans are now planning ahead and planting crops, domesticating nutritive plants, planting them in the ground one season and reaping the benefits another. This is the beginning of agriculture, and we have the Natufians to thank for it. They started to cultivate high-energy crops like rye, but they also knew how to party. The first evidence of beer fermentation was found on Natufian sites in 13,000 BC, and more importantly, they were the first to make bread. Natufians also show the first signs of occupation specializations as evidenced by the abundance of sickle blades found in Natufian sites. This would have been a natural evolution of their agricultural advantage. The Natufians lived all over the Middle East, from Syria to Upper Egypt. And with their new ability to feed themselves via agriculture, they went on to create the first known large human settlements and civilization. Dr. Yosef Lizaridis and Dr. Nadine Rowland from Harvard performed extensive genetic tests on Natufian archaeological remains. And this is what they found. Natufians had clear African DNA markers without any Neanderthal admixture. In other words, they were unmistakably Black Africans. These resourceful people were also the first to construct buildings out of stone. They often had central fireplaces as part of their stone dwellings. They buried their dead with their personal belongings. Dogs were often found in Natufian graves. This is very interesting, as we find this cultural meme later on in the Nubian Kemetic civilization complex in an amplified representation. Of course, the invention of agriculture spread quickly throughout the Levant, and Natufians began to mix with populations that had Neanderthal ancestry in the northwest and east. These new mixtures would spread agriculture to the rest of Europe and Asia. Non-Neanderthal mixture spread agriculture south, towards the Nile, where the precursor to the Nubio-Kemetic civilization was kick-started. Researcher Dr. Dorothy Garrett attests that the Natufians who were living in the Middle East since 13,000 BC would have been behind the construction of Göbekli Tepe soon after the Holocene period began. Although more research on this subject needs to be done, it stands to reason that the Natufians would have had the agricultural backing and specialization sophistication necessary to build the sites. Regardless, it is clear that the Natufians had an indelible influence in the region, one that would last until 5000 BC when the pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization, better known as Kemet, started to take form. But there is another group that went on to influence the Egyptian civilization, and they lived far in the western part of the Sahara. Our journey continues in Libya's southern edge, a domain of relentless dunes and scorching sun where only the toughest endure. The Tuareg. Amidst this unforgiving land, the 1960s unveiled an astonishing find: the preserved remains of a young boy, christened Ouan Muhujaj, nestled by rock formations bearing the same name. This precious discovery set in motion a decades-long quest, delicately unraveling the secrets shrouded by millennia. Through the intricate disentangling of Ouan Muhujaj, archaeologists navigated the labyrinth of Sahara's rich history, marked by unexpected twists that would alter the trajectory of civilizations trailing in its wake. One striking revelation pertained to the region's ancient inhabitants. In contemporary times, Libya is distinctively Middle Eastern. However, 3600 BC bore witness to a southern Libya inhabited by Black Africans, a fact inferred from DNA studies and copious rock art scattered across the ancient Sahara. The genetic analysis of Ouan Muhujaj not only confirmed these findings, but also shed light on a previously unknown African culture. Ouan Muhujaj, a 5-year-old black boy, was unearthed from the folds of history. His identity was determined through dental, cranial, and genetic analysis. However, carbon dating propelled the young boy into the spotlight, revealing him to be 5,500 years old, a revelation that redefined African history. This remarkable mummification technique surpassed Egyptian practices, predating the initial Kemetic mummifications by at least a millennium. The sophistication and mastery displayed in Ouan Muhujaj's mummification were astounding. An examination showed the presence of preserved organic matter and an almost intact skeletal structure. The process involved evisceration, akin to Nile Valley practices, thereby securing the Central Sahara as the birthplace of mummification. Did these practices influence the Kemetic techniques a millennium later, or were they independent developments? What triggered the prominence of cattle in their rock art? Clues etched across Saharan caves and rocks hint at a world similar to present-day Kenyan or South African savannas. Depictions of savanna animals, alligators, big cats, giraffes, rhinos, antelopes, hogs, all demand an environment rich in water, a testament to the region's past. Modern climatology and LiDAR satellite technology corroborate this, revealing a former wet marshland, crisscrossed by rivers and adorned by paleo lakes and towering grasses. Ground sediment samples further validate these findings. Domesticated animals, especially cattle, often take center stage in these ancient artworks, pointing towards early cattle worship predating even Kemetic traditions. Approximately 500 years after Ouan Muhujaj's mummification, the once lush savanna began to recede, succumbing to aridness. Driven eastwards in search of water, these people converged with another remarkable group from Central Africa at the Nile. This group, known for creating the 20,000 BC Ishango bone, demonstrated a deep understanding of advanced math, including relationships between prime numbers. This confluence, one culture excelling in mummification and the other in advanced mathematics, shaped the fertile banks of the Nile. The motifs of cattle worship, advanced mathematics, mummification, and Black African genetic diversity intertwined to form the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex, spanning from the pre-dynastic era to the New Kingdom. For the next major chapter in the history of civilization, we have to go to two locations in Africa. Between 7,000 and 5,000 BC, Africans started to go beyond the traditional abstraction of ideas by using cave drawings. They started to develop a convention for these concepts. This resulted in the first writing system ever used, called the Proto-Saharan script. Starting in Karga, modern-day Sudan, the script resembles later scripts also used throughout sub-Saharan Africa, especially in Sibidi. We now know that all the major writing scripts from Europe and Western Asia, Roman, Phoenicians, Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and so many more, have their roots in African writing systems, specifically the Nubio-Kemetic hieroglyphics and hieratic. See for yourself. Furthermore, the use of the base 10 number system that we have today also stems from the Africans in Kemet. In fact, let me quote Dr. Paul Rincon on the origin of the Greek numerals. Quote, "But one thing it seems the ancient Greeks did not invent was the counting system on which many of their greatest thinkers based their pioneering calculations. New research suggests the Greeks borrowed their system known as alphabetic numerals from the Egyptians and did not develop it themselves as was long believed." End quote. At the same time, in 5000 BC, a complex society starts to migrate down the Nile. This society is very ancient and carries with it traditions dating back to 20,000 BC, where they were already doing complex mathematics. Dr. Chukwunyere Kamalu shows in his research paper on the Ishango bone that Africans were performing complex mathematical operations and had knowledge of prime numbers in 20,000 BC. Characteristics of this mathematical knowledge can still be found in African cultures today. Armed with the knowledge of mathematics and writing, the Africans started migrating down the Nile and developed an increasingly complex pre-Nubian civilization that we are now calling pre-dynastic Egypt. Egyptologists like to talk about Nubia and Egypt as if they were two separate civilizations, but in fact they were part of the same civilization complex and were inhabited by phenotypically and genetically identical populations. Today, we often speak of ancient Greece and Rome as Greco-Roman, given how close and intertwined these civilizations were. Well, Nubia and Kemet were far more homogeneous. This can also be contrasted with the latter Assyrian civilization, who, although neighboring Kemet, borrowed from it but was never part of the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex. Egyptians' murals repeatedly distinguish between European type, the Semitic type, and themselves, which they drew identically to those we call Nubians. The Nubio-Kemetic or Nubio-Egyptian civilization was so advanced and so influential that it radiated its knowledge, influence, and people in the surrounding region. Soon after it began, we start to see complex civilizations popping up all over the Levant and the Mediterranean. Many Egyptians, often called by the ancient the Ethiopians, to denote their very black skin and woolly hair, migrated to the four corners of the ancient world and spontaneously sparked civilizations. This, coupled with the fertility of the land uncovered by the warming climate of the Holocene in the Mediterranean basin, would engender large population centers with complex inherited knowledge from Kemet. Nevertheless, by 4000 BC, a little east from Kemet, the Sumerian civilization was starting to take root in the valley shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates. Here, I would be remiss if I didn't quote the historian Runoko Rashidi in his seminal paper on the origin of Sumer and Elam. Ancient Sumer, the biblical land of Shinar, Modern Lower Mesopotamia flourished in the 3rd millennium BC, covering the territorial expanse of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. Embracing the shores of the Persian Gulf, Sumer extended north to Akkad, a distance of about 320 miles, thus constituting southern Babylonia. The appellation Chaldea, frequently applied to the region, appears to have been introduced by the Assyrians in the 9th century BC. The designations Babylon, Babylonia, and Chaldea have been used extensively, particularly by 19th century scholars, in reference to the area now almost exclusively known as Sumer. Sumer appears to be the first major high culture of Western Asia. She bequeathed to her successor states a tradition of great achievement. Her many contributions to civilization are well known. Brilliant agriculturalists, the Sumerians built very sophisticated canals and reservoirs to irrigate their fields. They possessed both an advanced legal system and a well-developed knowledge of medicine, and were perhaps the ancient world's greatest astronomers. While these salient facts regarding Sumer's obvious cultural genius are well known, the important question of the racial composition of its population is generally glossed over. This apparent cloud concerning race, however, is very thin, and there is a substantial body of evidence in support of the position that the civilization of Sumer was the product of black migrations from Africa's Nile Valley. This is not to argue that ancient Sumer was exclusively peopled by blacks, or that the Africans were the only early ethnic entity in the area. Sumer was at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and over the millennia there was a great deal of foreign intrusions and racial intermingling. In respect to Sumerian civilization, however, the black contribution was decisive and far overshadowed that of the later invaders. I would also like to quote John D. Baldwin in his book Prehistoric Nations. It is now admitted that a people of the Kushite or Ethiopian race, sometimes called Hamites, were the first civilizers and builders throughout Western Asia, and they are traced by the remains of their language, their architecture, and the influence of their civilization on both shores of the Mediterranean, in Eastern Africa and the Nile Valley, in Hindustan, and in the islands of the Indian Seas. Fast forward to 2000 BC, with a strong epicenter in the eastern Mediterranean basin, our civilization builders extended east and west, across the Atlantic and the Indian Sea. In Mesoamerica, they sparked the Olmec civilization, the mother civilization to all following complex civilizations in the region, like the Aztecs and the Maya. Their influence is found in their architecture. Writing. In the 18th century, the French missionary Pierre Maillard documented the hieroglyphics used by the Mi'kmaq. They lived in the areas of the Great Lakes, next to the Canadian province called Quebec, north of New York State. After Maillard documented their glyphs, they remained relatively unimportant until the 1970s, when Barry Fell undertook a comparative study of these glyphs with their Egyptian counterpart. The similarities were so numerous, they could not be attributed to chance. See for yourself. What followed, however, was an example of the many denial attempts by historians that many of us have become accustomed to. Historians did agree that the similarities were beyond what pure coincidence could explain. However, they dismissed the idea of Egyptians reaching the Americas as impossible. Even though it has been well documented that Kemet had seaworthy ships. In fact, in 1970, Thor Heyerdahl conducted 2 expeditions, Ra 1 and Ra 2, to demonstrate that Kemetic boats were seaworthy. They successfully sailed from Morocco to Barbados in 52 days. That is 12 days faster than Amerigo Vespucci. The architecture of the temples and monuments is also remarkably similar to Kemetu. Here is a little-known fact. The base of the Pyramid of the Sun is exactly the same as that of the Pyramid of Giza. Both have a base of 230 meter side, or 756 feet. This is remarkable, from the stone-built pyramids to the doorways and corbelled vault arches. These are not mere resemblances, but they carry signatures of the same methods of building and the same preference for materials. Both Egyptians and Mayan pyramids are built of limestones. Both cultures used pyramids as a burial place for their rulers, just like in Egypt. Even if the pyramids in the Giza complex were not built tombs, the majority of the 100 pyramids discovered to date in Egypt were tombs. All the pyramids in Nubia were also tombs. Other cultural and religious similarities can also be found. Both cultures had religious systems revolving around the sun god as the supreme deity, but they also had a Book of the Dead. The similarities also extend to how the Mayan measured time. Both Egyptian and Mayan calendars had a 365-day calendar without a leap year, referred to as the wandering year. Both calendars had their new years in July. In fact, the Mayan calendar can be seen as an inheritance from the Olmec calendar, also a 365-day calendar. And it doesn't stop there. Cranial deformation was also practiced in both cultures, especially the elites. In fact, it was practiced by all three major civilizations in Mesoamerica. Akhenaten and his son King Tut are both famous for having practiced cranial deformation, but this practice was also widespread in Olmec's, Mayan, and Aztec civilizations. The victory scenes from both cultures are virtually identical. See the depiction of the Narmer palette and scenes from the Aztec Codex. One of the most telling similarities between both these cultures is rooted in how they decided to record information. Could it be that their writings share some similarities? The similarities between Mayan and Egyptian hieroglyphs just cannot be attributed to chance. Both use phonograms followed by ideograms to relate meaning. These are pretty much the only languages in history to do so. The odds of that happening independently, randomly, and within the same time period is astronomically impossible. When you add all the other similarities, the conclusion becomes obvious. Just for context, other independently developed writing systems in the world look nothing like hieroglyphics. From this seeding, Mesoamerica grew, while maintaining contact with Africa all the way until the arrival of Columbus. But on the other side of Africa, far to the east, the Africans seeded yet another civilization, one that lasts till this day, and the signs can be seen in the key pillars of their culture, from their writing to their religion, architecture, and their philosophy. In 1990 BC, the god King Fuxi bestowed onto the land that was to become the Empire of the Middle government, domestication, cooking, philosophy, rule of law, monument building, as well as kanji, the system writing. These injections of culture set into motion the great wheel that was to become the Empire of China. As its first emperor, we must ask, where did he and the people he belongs to come from? Where did he draw his wealth of knowledge and culture from? And what evidence did the originators leave behind? Writing systems. The ancient Chinese characters, logograms, share significant similarities with the Egyptian hieroglyphics, Medu Neter. Both systems use symbols to represent entire words, and some symbols seem to share the same meaning in both languages. See how the representations of sky and sun are virtually identical or similar in roots to their Egyptian counterpart. Also notice how the older version of the Chinese characters look even closer to Medu Neter. In some instances, the symbols are pretty much interchangeable. See the ancient Egyptian logos for child and that of the Chinese, and there are a lot more. I'll leave the links in the description for you to explore. What's more, the Chinese tradition of calligraphy is compared to the meticulous art of writing hieroglyphics. Moreover, both civilizations revered the role of the scribe and had similar concepts of a god-king. We can even see the influence of the Africans on the early architecture of the Chinese. There are over 100 pyramids in the Xi area of central China, reminiscent of the pyramid-building tradition in ancient Egypt. Some Chinese pyramids are even larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Both cultures used pyramids as tombs, but they also practiced mummification and sarcophagus burials, believed in an afterlife where the soul continued as it did in life, and provided the dead with belongings for the afterlife journey. Even in their calendar systems, the Chinese lunisolar calendar is described as being almost identical to its older Kemetic counterpart. African cultural practices also permeated the Shang and Jia dynasties. The practice of naming children based on the day of the week in the Shang dynasty is seen as similar to the practice followed by the Ashanti in Ghana, which is believed to have originated in Kemet. Rome is indebted to the Etruscans, in the same way the Greek took almost all aspects of their civilization from Kemet, Egypt. The Etruscans lived between 800 and 300 BC in northern Italy. The Romans inherited the core elements of their civilization from the Etruscans. Before being displaced by the Romans, the Etruscans had already set the basis for the religion, art, and architecture that Rome would inherit. But it doesn't stop there. The Etruscans were known for their engineering prowess, particularly in the construction of roads and aqueducts, and the Romans adopted many of their engineering techniques, such as the use of drainage systems and underground tunnels. Even their writing system was the basis for the Roman alphabet. Unlike the Romans, the Etruscans were peaceful, but they were very technologically advanced. So who were these people that gave civilization to the Romans, and what did they look like? In his 2013 book, Black Origins of Ancient Rome, the German author Gert Müller explains how the black descendants of Kemet, ancient Egypt, created the sophisticated Etruscan civilization. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows that the black Etruscans were eventually displaced by the invading Romans who inherited their technology and science. Described as dark-skinned Africans, the Etruscans venerated the African sun god Ra from Kemet, Egypt, and even had Egyptian-like tombs. The Etruscans were so advanced that even their sewage waterworks are a marvel of engineering surviving till this day. The Romans would eventually grow to conquer the whole of the Mediterranean basin before collapsing in the 5th century AD. Not to be undone by the Chinese Sumerian, the Mesoamerican and the Mesopotamian, the Greek civilization can claim a large body of influence to the modernization trajectory of our world. Often overstated, Greek contribution should, however, be looked at within the context of those who taught them language, writing, art, science, and religion, not once but many times over. Yet still, the classical view of the Aegean civilization goes as follows. The earliest known civilization in Greece was the Minoan civilization, which emerged on the island of Crete around 2700 BCE. The Mycenaean civilization followed, beginning around 1600 BCE and lasting until around 1100 BCE. The period of ancient Greece, commonly referred to as Classical Greece, lasted from the 5th century BCE to the 4th century CE, and is credited with giving us philosophy, democracy, literature, art and architecture, mathematics, sciences, and Olympic Games. This is the narrative that we have all been taught. However, Greek history is far more interesting when you take into account what the Greeks themselves said about the origin of their civilization and knowledge. Here, let me quote Dr. Bruce Stewart about the Greek civilization. If you read what the Greeks said, not what we think, but what the Greeks said. They said they got everything from Egypt. They got all their knowledge from Egypt. Pythagoras spent 15 years in Egypt. Now, when did we come up with the idea that the Greeks invented everything from scratch? Believe it or not, it was in the 18th and 19th century. With the Greeks, again we see the significant influence of the Nubio-Kemetic people. Africans gave the Greeks their mathematics. From Pythagoras to Euclid, the Greeks studied Kemetic math and spent a great deal of time in Egypt. By 332 BC, however, the Greeks came in and liberated Egypt. The Greeks also inherited medicine from Kemet. Back in 2600 BC, the polymath Imhotep was already studying medicine and produced a number of medical texts, at least 2 millennia before Hippocrates. Nonetheless, it was the Greek, and later on the Arabs, who we have to thank for sharing these key sciences to our modern civilization. Back in the comfort of our modern civilization, we often forget how ancient medicine ineffective until the scientific method was applied to it by Imhotep. This was reflected by the fact that the ancient Egyptian had a significantly longer life expectancy compared to their contemporaries. With this longer life and more time on their hands, the Egyptians engaged in all sorts of leisure activities, including board games and Olympics, both of which they also taught to the Greeks. In fact, these mural paintings describe well some of the popular sports from Kemet. As early as 3000 BC, people from Kemet were participating in the Hebsed festival, where the reign of the pharaoh was celebrated with competitive sports. The pharaoh even participated in one of the races to show he was still fit. This gift of civilization to the Greeks by the Africans had to be repeated a number of times, as Greek civilization collapsed more than once. In the late Bronze Age, 1200 BC, the Mycenaean culture collapsed. The Egyptians from Kemet then reintroduced all concepts of civilization to the region. The civilizing influence of black people in the Levant and Near East is often overlooked, distorted, or, in many cases, reassigned to other peoples or civilizations. For people of African descent, it is vital to know that our antecedents had the knowledge, aptitude, and temperament to create civilizations of our own. Civilizations that were so influential that they birthed nearly all important instances of civilization and culture in European history. After the fall of Egypt, Kemet in 343 BC, following the Persian invasion and subsequent Greek rule by the Ptolemies, the Egyptians migrated to their ancestral home, south and southwest, deep in Africa. They took along with them their culture, language, and knowledge, which can be found pretty much intact throughout the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Their language is still spoken, almost intact in Senegal. Their religion, through ancestor worship, still lives strong in Africa. Its teachings have also been repackaged in other religions seen all over the world. Sun worship, emphasis of human and societal values, Mayat proper. Their building technique, mud bricks and stone monuments, are seen all over Africa. Its cultural practices, like circumcision, still intact. Above all, its people, through endless genetic studies and attestation of the ancients, are all over Africa, from west to east, from south to Sudan. As Africa and its descendants all over the world are experiencing a second renaissance, the echoes of their previous deeds and their previous contributions will guide its new dawn. Don't miss our documentary on how Africans' ingenious pyramid building technique isn't actually a secret and is still present in many African cultures today. Link in the description. I want to give a huge shout out to all our supporters, especially those on Patreon. Your support enables us to keep going. If you liked this long format, drop us a like. Above all, say so in the comment. We hear a lot about the negative voices, but it warms our hearts to hear your positive comments. Also, share our content on your social media. It goes a long way to helping spread the truth about our history. Follow us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.